Thank you so much for joining our event celebrating Far Villages, our most recent anthology. Full title is Far Villages, Welcome Essays for New and Beginner Poets. My name is Diane Goettel, and I'm the executive editor here at Black Lawrence Press. And I'm delighted that you've joined us this evening for a discussion of the poet's journey with contributors of this anthology. I'll begin by introducing tonight's poet essayists who will discuss their contributions to the anthology. And as they're speaking, please feel free to hop over into the chat box and drop any questions or comments. And then at the end, we will have a lively discussion about what it means to be a poet on this path. First up, we have J.G. McClure. Grab J.G.'s bio here. And sorry for taking a second. I have a 2-year-old. Everything's a little bit wild in my house. J.G. McClure holds an MFA from the University of California, Irvine. His poetry and prose appear widely, and maybe also wildly in Gettysburg Review, Green Mountains Review, Birmingham Poetry Review, Nashville Review, The Pinch, the Southern Poetry Anthology, and Best New Poets. He is the author of The Fire Lit and Nearing and the translator of Swimming. A 3-time Pushcart nominee, he is a book reviewer for numerous journals and teaches a variety of online writing workshops. Welcome, JG. I'm so excited to hear you talk about your contribution.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here and you know, in the anthology with so many awesome poets. So really excited about it. I'm just going to kind of jump in. So the essay that I have on this subject is called The Miseducation of the Poet, High School and the Fear of Poetry. And I'll be kind of jumping around as I go, but the gist is that you know, the way that we learn to talk about poetry in high school and before, I think kind of does damage to the sort of way that we tend to think about poetry, for sort of people who aren't like into it and don't really have the familiarity with it. So it starts when I was an undergraduate. Taking one of my first poetry workshops, my poet professor joked that high school is where poetry goes to die. I chuckled. I thought he was just joking, but I've since come to realize that what he was getting at is more of a systemic problem, that the way we're taught about poetry in high school, the last time that many people will likely read a poem in a sort of formal way, bleeds the living energy from poetry. So some context, at the time I wrote this essay, I was teaching a series of writing courses, some in poetry, some in literary journalism and some other things, and at a university. And I discovered that nearly all of the students simultaneously held 2 mutually exclusive notions about poetry. One, that poetry is easy, you just write whatever you feel. And 2, that poetry is impossibly arcane. It's all these and thous, Grecian urns and anapests. Among these students, these were, top students, top of their classes, only 2 or 3 of them had read or could name a contemporary poem. Most of them had read kind of the standard Shakespeare sonnets and, maybe some romantics, and that was pretty much it. So talk about in my high school experience, I was lucky. We did read a lot of poetry, and we had one teacher who really sort of, even though there weren't creative writing classes, he really took it on himself to kind of build that into his English classes. And so he had us writing poetry, but we would sort of write the poems and we would never really critique them or talk about them in any kind of workshop setting. It was just, you'd write them and that was it. The essay continues. It was obvious to me that my efforts were nothing in comparison to those of the great dead we were reading, and I had no sense of how to improve them. Nor did I understand why I did the things I did. I sat at a picnic table under a tree and wrote about some falling leaves and trampled acorns. Most likely we'd been reading Wordsworth, and I had intuited that poetry meant writing about transience and death and how great trees are. I had no sense that poetry had moved beyond those tropes, that contemporary poetry had been trying for decades to escape from the romantic tradition that still forms so much of its foundation. In the essay, The Education of the Poet, Louise Gluck, who just won the Nobel Prize, which is awesome. But Louise Gluck describes her discovery of poetry. She says, "I read early and wanted from a very early age to speak in return. When as a child I read Shakespeare's songs, or later Blake and Yeats and Keats and Eliot, I did not feel exiled, marginal. Rather, I felt that this was the tradition of my language, my tradition." End quote. Crucially, Gluck sees herself here in conversation with the great dead, not merely a passive recipient of their brilliance. And yet, think of your high school poetry courses. You'd read the poems, maybe recite them, learn the Greek names for metrical feet, talk maybe about imagery. You'd study the poem as an alien object, something complicated from the past to be reluctantly understood. The idea that you could speak back never entered into the discussion, at least not in my experience. Even when Mr. Moore, the teacher who took creative writing seriously, attempted to put us in conversation with the canon, we were cast less as writers in dialogue with other writers and more as clever parrots. We had to write an imitation of Whitman, using the stories and scenes of our own lives. Though we were making something, the goal was simply to fit our stories into the structure Whitman had established. It was an exercise in mimicry, and a good grade meant being a good mimic. Though there's certainly a value in learning about Whitman's music through imitation, the idea that we could speak back to Whitman or speak against Whitman never appeared. Setting aside the lack of dialogue with the poets of the past, consider how the poems themselves are discussed. What is the poet trying to say, the teacher asks, as if the poet had tried and failed to say something very simple. When Keats wrote, "Bold lover, never, never canst thou kiss, though winning near the goal, yet do not grieve, she cannot fade, though thou hast not thy bliss," what he meant to say was, urns are pretty cool, but maybe they're not always cool because, you know, etchings don't get old, but they can't move either, and that's kind of a bummer. In high school, every poem has to have a tidy message, and you have to be able to name it. What I mean is this: poems are taught as messages to be decoded, not as irreducible experiences. No wonder students are impatient with poetry. If the goal is simply to pick out the moral of the poem, then students are absolutely right that poetry is dull and overly complicated. Platitudes can be stated much more concisely in prose. This type of message hunting fails to convey that the way something is said is inextricable from what it means. It fails to convey that a poem is an experience the reader undertakes. It fails, in other words, to convey that there's any difference between the experience of reading, say, Hamlet, really feeling his indecision, his false starts and worries and paralysis and rage as they all unfold, and the experience of reading the SparkNotes summary of the play. Fast forward to college, to these students sitting in my intro to poetry class. They feel like their poems have to have a message, but that the message needs to be obscured by plenty of poetry with a capital P. The models that they have to work from are some faintly remembered Shakespeare sonnets, maybe some Keats, a lot of Hallmark cards. The result is highly overwritten language, a lot of purple greeting card speak used to dress up an otherwise simple moral axiom. Inevitably, most of these are in rhyme and meter because that's all these students have seen, and so, you know, that's what they know. Goes on, some students know that poems don't have to rhyme anymore, but they don't really have a sense of why a poet might use free verse in one situation and why a poet might use a sonnet in another. The idea that you don't just write whatever you feel, that the poem is a carefully made thing, that it is an ordered series of narrative / imaginative / sonic / moral experiences that the reader undergoes, is new. At first, students will ask how to know where they're supposed to break their lines. They want a formula. Poetry is, after all, just a bunch of rules. Remember all that stuff about iambic pentameter. When I tell them it's a question of what effects they want to create with their line breaks, that anything they do in the poem has myriad ramifications and precludes anything else they could have done in that moment instead, they're at once frustrated and relieved. Typically, someone will say, with a mix of complaint and awe, "I never knew writing poems was so hard." Around that point in the course, a funny thing starts to happen. The students, nearly all of them, start to really care about their poems. It goes on from there, but I think I'm about at my time, so I will cut myself off.
Thank you so much, JG. That was great. And I think so many of us have the experience of either, it seems like it's one or the other. You either, you know, high school is this place where poetry goes to die, or you have that one teacher, right? And I feel very lucky that I had that one teacher, and she actually wasn't even my teacher. She just was another English teacher in the school that started a sort of poetry appreciation gaggle of students, and it, you know, started to set me on this path. So thank you so much for that. That was really wonderful. Next up, we have Tanis MacDonald. Tanis is a poet, scholar, and editor. She's author of 3 books of poetry, with the fourth, and the fourth is Mobile. Her book of essays, Out of Line, Writing Outside the Big City, was published by Woolsack and Wynne. She is co-editor of Gush, Menstrual Manifestos for Our Time, and has taught an entire generation of creative writers across Canada. She is professor in the Department of English and Film Studies of Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And I hope I didn't butcher the pronunciation of your institution.
No, great. That's great. Thank you, Diane. No, Wilfrid Laurier University it is indeed. And, you know, I was listening to that and wondering how I could have possibly taught an entire generation of students when I am so young. Anyway. I think of this all the time. I want to thank Jonathan for going first and for his address of miseducation when it comes to poetry. I think it's a very important conversation, and it's that long conversation that lies between the easy and the arcane is the conversation I always feel like I'm having with my students, and really indeed with myself as well. So thanks very much for that. What I'm going to read is called a section from Rowing Away from the Desert Island of Genius. And I wanted to address it because my students often ask me, among other questions, you know, how should a writer be, right? So what's the difference between a kind of genius isolation and just everyday loneliness? And I think I address everyday loneliness with them a lot, but they want to hear more about the isolation of genius. So I wrote this. Writers are often shy or introverted people, so the myth of the isolated genius can feel attractive because it makes our sometimes devoutly desired isolation appear as though it is solely a function of our superior brains, rather than a stark manifestation of our loneliness or social awkwardness. Who wants to admit to those? It's so socially awkward to admit to social awkwardness. The benefit of remaining isolated as an artist is that you never have to pay attention to anyone else's art, or even acknowledge that anyone else makes art. Put too many owls in a small cage, and they will gaze out of the bars, affecting serenity and independence, narrowing their eyes as though to assert, there are no other owls, no other owls. There will be times when you need to do this as a poet, to meet a deadline, to start a project, to work on something challenging, but it's no way to live for much longer than a week. There are inevitably other owls. I still laugh remembering the time that I read about a famous novelist's process, including his rigorous routine of writing from 10 o'clock to 5 o'clock every day in complete isolation, except for lunch at noon sharp prepared by his wife and his 3 o'clock break when his wife would knock on the closed door to his office and bring him coffee and cookies. So that meant that the great man was isolated for exactly 2 hours at a time. Well, that's nice work if you can get it. The truth is that the myth of the isolated genius benefits very few artists, and women and BIPOC artists almost never. It's a romanticized image made popular by the media via boasts of a handful of writers who assert their individualism as being beyond the need for peers. Of course, decades of literary criticism invested heavily in the great man theory, the assertion that genius requires no explanation and no context, that some writers are just transcendent and anyone who is anyone thinks so. Now, believe me, I understand the appeal of this claim. It's a heady idea that writers can tap into an idea beyond the ken of the great unwashed reader. If I thought that it would get me coffee and cookies delivered to my office every day at 3 o'clock, I might subscribe to such a theory of unquestionable natural-born genius myself. But the truth is more realistic. All artists are the product of their culture, including beginner artists. The truth is also a good deal less romantic, and quite frankly, it's a relief to admit. There may be a good deal of mystery in how an idea makes it to the page, but you don't need a direct pipeline to the gods. Even Thoreau had neighbors at Walton Pond. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I'll just plug this quickly. If you don't yet have a copy of Far Villages and you like what you're hearing tonight, you can head on over to the Black Lawrence Press website. I will drop a link in the chat box shortly with a code to get 25% off. Thank you so much, Tanis. That was wonderful. And I have to ask, was it Murakami that you were referencing as the
No, no, you know, it really wasn't, but I find it interesting that people often guess, and it's never the person I was thinking of, which just says that this is a kind of myth that is very widespread, right?
Well, I've heard Murakami talk about how hard he leans on his wife to keep his writing life going the way that it is, and sort of meals just appear, and space to work is pretty, you know, organized and presented, and so on and so forth. So,
well, you know, I don't want to say that a cup of tea has never shown up unbidden in my office. It has happened. However, it has not been quite the kind of rigorous routine that is cited in the great man theory. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that. And again, also please feel free to use the chat box to drop comments and questions for our readers, and we'll review them at the end. I'm sorry, panelists, we'll review them at the end. Next up, we have Christine Beck. Christine holds a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing from Southern Connecticut State University and is the author of Blinding Light, I'm Dating Myself, and Stirred Not Shaken. She is the poetry editor of The Perch, a journal of the Yale Program for Recovery and Community Health. Christine teaches poetry, creative writing, and literature at the University of Hartford and in private workshops. She is a former president of the Connecticut Poetry Society and currently directs its monthly series at which poets moderate discussion about a well-known poet at the Hartford Public Library. She was poet laureate of the town of West Hartford, Connecticut from 2015 to 17. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you very much. It's been great fun for me to read the other authors who are on the panel this evening, and it's nice to know that I'm in great company. I actually am going to talk about someone that I consider to be a great man, with no offense to the title, The Great Man, and I've edited this down from a longer essay that appears in the book called Hearing Voices. So bear with me. Hearing Voices. It was 2003. Perched on a metal folding chair in Robert Frost's barn in Franconia, New Hampshire, we were 50 would-be poets, swatting mosquitoes in the heat and transfixed by a man who promised to teach us to be poets, although he was not himself a poet. Donald Sheehan was a classics professor from Dartmouth, who had created an annual conference for poets called the Frost Place. Don was an imposing figure. He had a white flowing beard that reached to his belt buckle and blue eyes that contrasted like summer sky against the clouds of his beard. Yet his clothing was what you'd expect from a Dartmouth professor: blue checked shirt and gray slacks. Don looked like the pictures of God I'd seen in children's Bible books, the grandpa everybody wanted, but nobody actually had, except maybe Heidi. Don emanated calm. He seemed to see beneath our desire to be special, and he convinced each of us that we were extraordinary. His voice was soft, yet radical and compelling. He spoke slowly and kindly, as if he were speaking to children. Yet his voice betrayed a hint of world weariness, an undercurrent of suffering, but also an expansiveness of spirit, as if we were the prodigals finally home and he had cooked the fatted calf. Don recognized our inner 3-year-olds, perched on our metal chairs, wanting to yell, "Choose me, call on me." Our desire for admiration was as palpable as if we'd waited the fateful announcement of who would play the lead in the school play. We all thought that success as a writer meant publication, fame, bestseller list. Notebook at the ready, poised to write 10 tips to make the world love my words, I was not prepared for his advice. Settle down, Don said. The answer is not where you're looking. It's not in praise or publication. Don asked us to, quote, let go of the fantasy of being discovered. Look next to you. Find the person who sits alone, doesn't have a friend, no gaggle of supporters, no one saving them a seat. Find that person and fall in love with their writing. Your task is to read the work of another, sharper, clearer. The root of joy is to fall in love with the work of another. No name tags, said Don. We were to learn to recognize each other, pay attention, use no memory crutches. Well, I wasn't good at memorizing names. Once someone introduced themselves, I was usually too embarrassed to ask them to repeat their name. But I had to make a connection, name tags or not. As I was standing in line for lunch on the grass, I stepped on a bee. A sudden surge of pain shot from my foot up my leg. Now, I hadn't been stung since I was a kid, and I realized that if I keeled over from anaphylactic shock, no one would have any idea what had happened to me. So I turned to the woman behind me and I said, sorry, but would you mind just watching me for a few minutes? I was just stung by a bee and I want someone to know that in case I have a reaction. Of course, she said, and began to watch me intently. The line moved slowly. I'd asked her to watch me, but I hadn't been prepared for her steady gaze. After about 5 minutes, I said, oh, okay, well, I'm fine. By the way, I'm Christine. Patrice, she said. But she was not done watching. Stop, please, stop. Really, I'm okay. I finally got her to stop by asking her about herself, which was one of Don's suggestions. Patrice was a teacher at a private high school. She taught at what was called a Waldorf school, and her course was called Eurythmy, a kind of movement between Tai Chi and modern dance. I asked her to show me. Wearing a diaphanous long-sleeve blouse, long curls blowing in the wind, Patrice stood on a grassy slope, the White Mountains at her back, and as unself-consciously as if she were reaching for a napkin at the dinner table, began a flowing series of movements in which she raised and lowered her arms while bending back and forward. She looked like an elegant crane, and she inspired me to write about the elegance of cranes. The crane, the light against its angles in dark water, otherworldly in elegance, and still, so still, and its breast beating so hard, I could almost see its heart just there, below the sheen of feathers that I wanted to reach, but could not reach. You asked me what I wanted, and I thought of the crane, its long, resilient neck so thin compared with my desire. And I didn't know how to say it, that I wanted to rest on the bench, silent and serene, like the crane, secure in knowing that no one could hurt a crane. No one would hurt something so close to innocence, like water falling down 1,000 feet of cliff, sprinkling rainbows over stone. I wanted the knowledge of the crane, the certainty that I am of both sea and shore, and yet not either sea or shore. I am here, and it is there, and all the traveling I want to do is from here to there. I fell in love with Patrice the way Don suggested, with her style, her grace, her natural way of expressing herself with her body. Her movements fit effortlessly against the vast expanse of the White Mountains, as if she were a falling petal. At the end of the week, Don shared a prayer. In my following years of poetry conferences, lectures, workshops, and readings, I have never, ever found anyone bold enough to pray. He said, grant that I may deal straightforwardly and wisely with each person, neither saddening nor embarrassing anyone. I later learned that Don came by this prayer and the beard and his firm belief in the value of being fully present and extending oneself to others through a series of events that touched me profoundly. That's when I learned that he and I shared a bond. He disclosed that he had been raised by a violent, alcoholic father, as I had been. After his father's death, Don visited his father's grave and read aloud a letter in which he told his father he was okay and he forgave him. It ended, "I love you. You love me. Do not forget this." Shortly after his long drive home from the cemetery, Don began to hear voices. They said, "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of mercy, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner." The voices continued day after day, tormenting him. Believing he might be going insane, Don ultimately discovered that the words came from an Eastern Orthodox prayer. He found an Orthodox church and converted, hence the beard. Why do I believe that Don actually did hear voices? Something about his sense of inner calm, his desire to teach a bunch of competitive would-be writers to practice the spiritual principle of seeking first to help another, convinced me that he was genuine. Don led me to wonder if my own father, a damaged man who had longed to be a writer, dead over 40 years, is with me today as I read these words. The rational part of me would say, impossible. But the spiritual part of me says, all things are possible. The last photo I have of me and my dad is of us standing in front of the rescue mission where he lived after my mother divorced him and he became homeless. I used that faded photo to write about my dad. I practiced the wisdom of Don. Grant that I may deal straightforwardly and wisely with each person, neither saddening nor embarrassing anyone. Don Sheehan, a quiet man who survived the trauma of a violent childhood, who heard voices, who each year embraced a group of ego-driven writers, as if we were the child who won the spelling bee, found joy in encouraging and inspiring young writers. I have never heard the voice of God, but I still hear the voice of Don. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. I really appreciated that. It was wonderful also to hear you read the poem that I've read so many times in this essay as we've gone through various iterations and prepped the manuscript. Not iterations of the poem, but iterations of the manuscript. And I love that, you know, this is a general discussion of the poet's journey, but we keep coming back to teachers tonight. And so many of you here are also teachers yourselves. So something for us to discuss a bit more at the end of the readings. Thank you, Christine. We're going to move on now to Erin Brown, who is the author of the poetry collection Acacia Road, winner of the 2016 Gerald Cable Book Award. Congratulations. And of the memoir Less Than What You Once Were. He has published work in Michigan Quarterly Review, Image, World Literature, Today Online, Waxwing, and Transition, among others. And he is a contributing editor for Windover and Transition, among others. Windover, and blogs regularly at Ruminate. Brown grew up in Chad and now lives in Texas, where he is an assistant professor of English and directs the Writing Center at Latorno University. He holds an MFA from the University of Maryland. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you for having me. Thank you again to Diane, to Abayo, to Black Lawrence Press for putting this book together. And so great to be with all of you tonight. So I'm going to kind of introduce a little bit of the reading because I'm going to read the middle of the essay. And so this essay that I wrote on mediation for this book kind of talks about, I guess it critiques how, as poets, we wrestle with trying to capture the moment. I think sorry, my dog is clacking around here, so if you hear her growl, maybe write a poem about it or something, I don't know. But So I think we like to be, as poets, we like to be critics of people who take pictures and, you know, are on their phones and trying to constantly capture the moment. But the irony is, as a poet, that's exactly what we're doing. And so I remember, you know, as early as grad school, wrestling with this, like, gosh, like, I'm not just enjoying the moment, I'm thinking about how I can turn it into a poem, and really wrestling with that. And so this kind of is what this essay is about. So I'm going to start, it's on looking at the last paragraph of page 370. I haven't written a good poem in 6 months, whatever writing a good poem means. If that means a poem you can sit back after finishing its final line, realizing that there is real felt experience, to quote Mary Oliver, within it, then I probably haven't written a good poem in a year. All too often, I try to encroach upon the poem, to make of it what I want, to turn it into the poem with a capital P rather than the poem. And here I nod to Ben Lerner, who discusses that in The Hatred of Poetry, it's a wonderful book, our need to get away from what we think of as the poem and become comfortable with just writing poetry in its mundaneness and in its beauty. Is my trespassing into the poem a trespassing into the sacred? Or are poems the same as afternoon runs? You go on them when you can, and sometimes your body hums in pleasure. Other times the first mile is the experience of hell itself. Whatever this pursuit is, my poems keep coming out flat, drained of any real feeling. In my writing life, I'm beginning to realize that not every experience, not every memory, not every thought can be made into a poem, and that's okay. Mediating experience into poetry is not something that can be forced, nor is mediation always beneficial. There are other forms, the lyric essay, the short story, that are perhaps more suited for a certain experience, a certain thought. And I find myself writing in these forms more and more. I feel guilty acknowledging poetry's own failure to express everything, a failure that is probably rooted in my own inability. Still, perhaps it is poetry's own failure to mediate every experience that makes it what it is. If poetry is a consecration of experience, there must be something outside of that consecration to provide contrast. Is it heresy for me to say that genres other than poetry are not as sacred, that they exist to elevate or at the very least differentiate poetry as such? And while poetry consecrates, surely it cannot consecrate everything. If it could, poetry wouldn't have the same distinctive power. It wouldn't be poetry. So this is something that I've written about in this essay and I've wrestled with a lot as a poet, is just, I don't know, the kind of almost hypocrisy of trying to take a moment, a beautiful moment, turn it into a poem. And so that's kind of what I've tried to get at here. And kind of the failure of poetry. You know, I think of, there's a poem by Christian Wyman that's titled, "So Much a Poet He Despises Poetry." And of course there's the Marianne Moore line, "I too dislike it," you know, about poetry. We have this love-hate relationship with poetry. And so anyway, I think that's kind of something I've been thinking about, that a poem can't fit every experience, and that's okay, being comfortable with that, you know. So anyway, thanks.
Thank you so much, Erin. I appreciate that. And I think probably a lot of writers have that same experience where you're walking through you're walking through a moment and you're already trying to take notes and think about how it's going to work on the page. I had a dear friend, I have a dear friend who's a photographer, and she kind of always lives with the lens between her and the world. And I think that we do the same thing, don't we? Thank you, Erin. Thank you so much. And last up, we have Diana Rosen, who is a journalist and the author of 13 nonfiction titles on food, beverage, and other lifestyle topics. She contributes to several online websites on tea and blogs at the Los Angeles Public Library docents. More than 60 of her poems, haiku, flash fiction, and essays have appeared in print or online in journals, books, and anthologies. Redbird Chapbooks accepted her manuscript for publication. I guess it was out. It's already out. It was out last year, and she lives and works in Los Angeles. Welcome, Diana.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's wonderful to be with such diverse people, and thank you so much for hosting this. I think I never ever thought that my journey would be poetry. I started off as a journalist because in high school, everybody was always asked, what are you going to do? What are you going to be? You're going to go to college. What are you going to study? And the only thing that interested me was being on the high school newspaper. So I knew that writing and words were important. The other thing that I realize now is that other people saw something in me that led me to poetry. My aunt gave me a diary when I was a young girl. My sister gave me books of collected poetry, even though she never read any. And so and a cousin still has a photo that I took of robin's blue eggs that was in a tree outside the window, and I was the only one who noticed it. So sometimes people tell you what you need to know, either in gifts or in conversations. So my contribution is paving the way to a poet's life. And I'll just read part of it for you. I didn't even know I was on a journey when I first began to write poems in my late 40s, no less. I was working in a bookstore along some stellar poets who introduced me to a whole new world of contemporary men and women poets who astonished, energized, bedazzled me with what they wrote about and how. As a journalist writing nonfiction books and articles, I was used to space constrictions, and a short poem can definitely be constricting. I also pursued facts, not fiction, so the poet's journey both freed and challenged me. A poetry prompt is different than an editor's assignment to get the story. It is something totally opposite. It is an invitation to release imagination, leap into experimentation, conjure images with no other purpose than to put on the page and see how it flows. While I never gave up the storytelling element of journalism, I was no longer attached to the precision of factual reportage that is necessary for genuine news stories while writing my poems. Technically, I was free to drop articles, give up subject, verb, object, play with metaphor and simile, embrace music within my poems, from inner rhymes to cadence within the lines. And emotions, what a fraught word. Good, bad, ugly, hurtful, blissful. At first, writing about them was a release of almost immeasurable comfort. Then came the conundrum of writing about experiences best discussed with wise counsel. Are these dives into despair self-indulgent? How could they possibly engage a reader you don't even know? Is the personal ever truly universal? What is the role of a poet? Still struggling with those answers, I was invited to share my poems at readings, and I loved the experience. Listening to other poets taught me so much about presentation, theater, and honoring the words. More than anything, reading my poems aloud to a live audience was concrete evidence of what worked and what didn't quite. Writing poems like novels and short stories is, in a way, like being an actor. You can enter different worlds, become different people, and make the endings of stories you know so well just the way you want them to be, not as they were or are. I'm still learning, and I love that there is still so much to master. Do you need advice? I have suggestions. They are to go at your own speed, pay attention to what works and doesn't, and learn to understand why. Challenge yourself with consistent practice and share what you learn with others. Most of all, have fun. Traveling on the poet's journey is like mastering a musical instrument. It's all about the practice. In a letter to reporter Maurice Eisenberg, written after the Germans were driven out of France in 1944, the celebrated cellist Pablo Casals wrote, "Now that the enemy has been forced to leave, I have resumed my practicing, and you will be pleased to know that I feel that I am making daily progress." Whether you have been forced into silence or have abandoned the practice of your art, I urge you to resume the practice. You will find solace, excitement, sorrow, satisfaction, and much joy. The end.
Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you very, very much. And Diana actually emailed me a list of questions for her fellow panelists before we got started this evening. And I think we'll start with those. We don't have any quite here in the chat box yet. Of course, feel free to drop any in. The first one is for you, Tanis. And Diana asks, your essay reminds me of the idea that writers write in between distractions. How do you avoid or ignore distractions, and has your writing life evolved to a practice?
You know, I like to think I have a practice, though. You know, the moment I say that, I also want to confess to deviating from practice all the time, right? Like many of you, I have a demanding job with serving people who are trying to find their way in this profession, and it's I spend a lot of time doing that. But I would say that, and maybe I'm branching off from the question, Diana, but you tell me, that there's something about teaching that brought me back to my practice in a particular way, because the more I instructed students about, you know, well, try this, and you could do that, I had to ask myself, am I doing that? And if I'm not, why not? And so after a while, it became a case of me needing to take my own advice. And also, you know, needing to report back to the students. You know, I'm trying this method too. I'm thinking about this kind of way of writing also, which is why I'm discussing it in class. I'm not discussing it because I know it perfectly. I'm discussing it because I think it's an ongoing question or an ongoing methodology or practice that we should have. Okay, I think I've thoroughly gone off the road of the question. Can you repeat it for me, Diane?
Sure. It says, your essay reminds me of the idea that writers write in between distractions. How do you avoid or ignore distractions? And has your writing life evolved to a practice?
Yeah, I would say that what I've done is made my distraction the reason to keep writing, that I've made my teaching practice the reason to keep moving forward. because, you know, there's that joy of being in a room and everybody there is thinking about poetry, right? Everyone there is thinking about how to go further with it. And I know that some people, you know, say, well, how do you, you know, sort of splice the difference between teaching and writing? And the way I do it is I don't splice it. I do them at the same time. I think of them in the same way. And that's become my practice, which I know is not everyone's, but that's how I've done it.
Thank you. And to the other panelists, would you like to chime in and talk about how you manage distraction and what you have evolved as your poetry practice? You know, two absolutely huge questions. You could just pick one.
I have a rule now that I always do the free writes alongside my students because often that's the only time I will get during the day to write. And actually, I've had some okay poems come out of that. And the students, usually there's this bond of, you know, you're suffering together. So that's kind of a rule I've set for myself now. And it's been good.
Erin, I'll ask a follow-up question to that. I know in a lot of workshops, some people feel like it's that free writing time is just to generate, and other people really like to immediately share what they got down. Do you ever share what you wrote with your students?
Sometimes it depends. Usually, if I do that, I will kind of it will be after a long period of awkward silence, where it's clear that all these introverted writers do not want to share their work, and so then I will then I'll share, but I'll kind of be like very self-deprecating, you know, and I want to do that just to show them like I can be a professor, you know, I can have published poetry, but I'm still writing rough drafts just like you guys, and it's still pretty bad rough drafts. So I try to do that to kind of demystify the process.
That's great. Our next question is for Christine, and Diana asks, you mentioned the influence of Dawn and Patrice. Her concept of eurythmy sounds interesting. Does this eurythmy, walking, or any form of movement influence your poetry?
For me? So that is an interesting question. And it ties into the issue of a practice, having a writing practice. I'm extremely lucky in that I don't actually sit down at my desk and write, you know, from 8 in the morning till 10 or whatever it might be. I rely on inspiration. And so far, it has not failed me. That said, I have to put myself in places where inspiration shows up. So I go to poetry readings, and I almost always come out of a poetry reading with a rough draft or an idea of something that I want to write. And I've just come to rely upon that when I'm in the spirit of poetry, poetry shows up. I will take my telephone with me when I'm out walking, and I will dictate into my telephone if I've got an idea. And I also have favorite poems that I've dictated to myself on my phone that I will listen to when I'm walking. So I do find that kind of the flaneur of kind of walking around waiting for some inspiration to strike has worked for me. But I would say the thing that has worked the absolute best for me is for the last 20 years, I've had a poetry group. They used to meet every other Thursday. And now since COVID, we're meeting every Thursday. Can you imagine having to have a new poem every Thursday? Well, not all of them are good poems, but there's something about that knowing you have a deadline. I actually love to write to deadline. Knowing I have a deadline is actually very good for me. And so, you know, I bring poems in. And today in class, because we were talking about revision, I took in the last poem that I took to my group, and I marked up the comments in the margin that they had given me. And then I showed my students how I revised based on their comments. And I wanted students to see that the kinds of things that in a workshop, you know, when you're actually working poetry week in and week out, the kinds of comments that you get and the kinds of things that you can do to revise. So, you know, like Erin, I'm willing to like put myself on the line and show them kind of what it's like. And that's also very, very helpful for me. So that's kind of a multifaceted answer. Thank you for asking.
I think a lot of people are going to come out of this time with a lot more generated work than they would usually have. And I've seen that on my end as an editor. We're getting more submissions. People are writing more and revising more and submitting more. And it's wonderful to see. It's really terribly exciting. So one a week, they're keeping you busy. Thank you, Christine. I've got the next question is, sorry, I have a couple of screens here. The next question is for JG, and actually it addresses a part of your essay that I think you kind of skipped over a little bit as you were wandering your way through. Diana asks, the concept of literary journalism was a new one to me and quite exciting because it was from a front page column by Ernie Pyle I read in one of my parents' books that led me to study journalism and to understand the essentials of storytelling in any form is connected to the reader. Is there an Ernie Pyle writing today? Is there a consummate example of literary journalism in print or online that you would recommend? So maybe if you could introduce this concept a little bit of literary journalism, and then move into the question about recommendations for further reading.
Yeah. So it was kind of new to me when I started teaching it too, which was kind of a cool experience to be kind of learning it alongside, or one step ahead of the students. But yeah, so the idea is to take like the techniques of poetry and fiction and apply it to journalistic writing. So when you go to a typical newspaper article for just like, who, what, when, where, like, let's, just raw information, let's get through it. You're not reading for like the beauty of the sentence, and it gives you, the facts of what happened, but it doesn't really give you like the, lived experience of what it was like to be the person in that situation. And so, literary journalism tries to, get at that and sort of, it's not like a human interest story exactly, but it's that kind of giving the more experiential side of news. And there are so many examples. There are a lot of anthologies that it's hard to go wrong. But and I think there's also lots of like subcomponents. Certain types of like even true crime writing, you could say, is a subspecies, something like In Cold Blood or something like that. Anything from that to, certain kinds of memoir where it's, the way that one's life intersects with, these sort of larger historical events and so forth. Or it can be a more sort of traditionally journalistic endeavor where you're kind of embedding yourself with, with a group and kind of writing about what they do, and there are some really interesting examples of that. But yeah, it's just a really kind of big topic, so hard to really give a consummate example. But again, there are really great anthologies around it.
Thank you so much. Thanks. And the last question from Diana is for Aaron. You bring up a critical question about how photographing everything, because we can, sometimes trivializes our actual experience. Do you get inspiration from print photos, perhaps of your childhood, or those random ones found in thrift stores? If so, have they inspired you? If not, how do images, photos, or others feature in your poems?
That's a great question. So I do, from time to time, try to write an ekphrastic poem, right, which is a poem that's based on a painting or an image. But I've also done the same for like photography. I actually have there's a free write I like to do in my creative writing classrooms where I kind of bring in headline images and have, without any context or the headlines attached to them. And then I get students to kind of like wrestle with the image and to try to describe and create a narrative around what they see. And so I find images can be pretty powerful, and certainly with my own life, if there's a time where I feel like I haven't written a poem in a while, I'll go back through those childhood photos and see pictures of friends or see pictures of memories I had forgotten about, and things come flooding back. And so then, I'll translate that into a poem. So images can be very helpful, for as much as much criticism as I'm giving that. They definitely have their place, and it's always a good fallback option, I think, to my writing practice. So thanks for asking that question. It's a good one.
Would anyone else like to chime in about how images influence their poetry and their practice? Okay, we're good. One of those silent moments that Erin was talking about, like in class. That's great. Well, I don't see any other questions. We did have a little bit of a discussion in the chat, which was fun to follow, about how many people here worked on their high school newspapers. Tanis asked that. I don't know if everyone saw it, so can we just do a show of hands who worked on their high school newspapers? This one. I should probably do more like this one too. I was more like that. So that's interesting. Do we have any other little last minute questions we have going on? Anything else you guys want to ask?
I can ask a question.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the poet's journey, and it seems as if failure is a big part of that journey. So what are some of the big failures that our panelists have had, and how were they able to right the ship?
Good one. Who wants to jump in first?
I guess I can start. I mean, I've not so much like a one big failure, but I think like one of the hard things for me was, you know, like first starting out, no idea what I was doing, sending poems to journals, and like, obviously they're going to publish them because they're brilliant. And then like, that was not what happened. And so kind of learning that like rejection is a normal thing, and not to sort of take it personally, and, you know, just to kind of get back on the horse, so to speak, was, I think, important, and just kind of developing a thicker skin around that, and letting go of these kind of like, you know, mythic fantasies of, you know, I'm just going to throw my work out into the world, and of course it will be well received and so forth.
You know, I think one of the most
I think of, oh, sorry, go ahead, Christine.
I was going to say one of the nicest antidotes to failure, because obviously we all, if you're looking to have your work published, you're going to deal with rejection. You just simply are. And it's more true now than it's ever been, because the MFA programs are churning out poets, and there are more and more journals. And the competition is very, very tight. But what I love about writing poetry is, if I wanted to, I could go to a poetry reading every night of the week, and I could actually read my work out loud. Not every writer has that opportunity. You know, not every writer has the ability to read, you know, a chapter of a novel to people who want to hear what they have to say. And that has been remarkable. And so what can I say? It has shifted my focus from, and that's what Don Sheehan was saying, right? He was saying publication should not be your goal. Your goal should be to fall in love with the work of another poet, and to be able to share it, and to be able to listen to their work and have them listen to your work. That, I think, is one of the beauties of poetry. And it's what keeps me going, because, you know, if I was just sitting in a room all by myself sending out poems and hoping to get them published, I'd be pretty miserable by now. And I think that poetry is actually very fun and very inspiring, but it's because there's a community of poets.
Yeah, and my comment kind of fits exactly with that. I think from my experience, the graduate writing workshop gets you very used to failure very quickly. And so it's kind of a purifying by fire kind of process of just continually, you know, having a great poem, submitting it to workshop. This is why writing groups are so great. Is because they bring you down, bring that ego down, and they give you stuff, they pick those things out that you were turning a blind eye to. But also, you know, to kind of connect it back to several of the pieces that you guys read earlier, to talk about those kind of mentors, those great mentors, the great poets kind of in your life. There's a passage in my essay I didn't read, I probably should have, where I bring one of those, like, you know, poems that were recording experiences. I bring it to her, and this was in grad school, and she just kind of was like, no, this isn't, you're not going to be able to do anything with this poem. It's not, you know, it's just not there. It's just, you know, not on point. It's not interesting enough, you know. And sometimes, and for me, I remember that being like a failure moment, you know. I was like, I had such high hopes for that poem. But we also need those great, you know, kind of mentors in our lives who tell us, you know, like, hey, this wasn't working, but keep doing this, you know. And so I think that's those people have definitely been present in my life, but I definitely encourage, you know, both find your peers, but also find people, you know, who've gone before you, who can guide the way for you. So.
I'll say a little something. I think every time I'm jealous of another writer, that's a failure. I mean, I think it's hard not to be. And you know, it comes and goes. I've got, you know, months and years go by and I feel just copacetic. I'm glad for people who get great book deals, who get nominated for awards, and it's great. And then sometimes I descend into the valley of bitterness. And I think I'm failing myself when I do that. I mean, I'm failing my own aesthetic, which really should be exactly as Christine has said, to fall in love with another's poetry and to support people in the community and to cheer that poetry is getting it's getting a bigger reputation, all of those things. But I can't pretend that I don't feel this sometimes. And certainly part of the reason why I write about the poet's life is to admit to a whole bunch of things that I think my students think are things that they, shameful things that they feel. And I think, oh no, are you kidding? We all feel them. So I always admit to, I try to admit to these kinds of vulnerabilities. And yeah, so I would say that jealousy and envy of other writers is my ongoing failure. I sometimes rise above it, and sometimes I really don't. So yeah, I wanted to add that.
Diana, do you want to chime in at all about the experiences of failure and moving through them?
I can't actually say that I thought a lot about the success or failure. I just think it's such a challenging mountain to climb about learning about poetry. And it, in a way, it's just continuously exciting to me. And where some form or formats are not really that interesting to me, I try to take classes in almost everything that's standard, the villanelle, the sonnet, all these things. And what happened for me is the poetry impacted my journalism. It made me much more careful about word selection. It made me really think about musicality and flow and cadence. And so whether I got published or not for a particular poem became less and less important. And what became more important is, how am I improving overall as a writer, no matter what genre I'm writing in? And I wouldn't say I'm not a jealous person or not competitive. I am, but I think everybody who gets a book offer, everybody who gets and acceptance, it's great. I love it because it means that there's more opportunity and more chance for me to be successful and for everybody else. And I think somebody else mentioned this too, is that the opportunity to publish these days has multiplied 1,000-fold. That doesn't mean that every publication is great, but you can at least amass a few credits somewhere if you want to satisfy that lust for publication. And the other thing is that a lot of people are self-publishing. And while I think it's not for everybody, it worked for Walt Whitman, and he did it for almost 30 years of his life. So, and he was continuously rewriting, because a lot of the reasons why he kept republishing his work is he was making changes that sometimes reflected the changes in his own life, and sometimes perhaps different attitudes that he had about the things that he wrote about. So this is a great time for poetry and a great time for writers. And I say embrace it all. If you don't win the Pulitzer or the Nobel, don't worry. You know, you have fun with it, enjoy it, and keep on learning because it's exciting.
That's such a great perspective, Diana.
That's
And in addition to there being so many journals out there, there are also, I mean, of course, there's the big 5 publishers, and wouldn't we all love to have book deals with them? But there are hundreds of small presses just here in the United States. Tanis, I know that you're in Canada, but we are distributed by a wonderful organization in California called Small Press Distribution, and they have over 450 presses and some micro presses just on just the presses that they take care of. That's not including presses that have other distributors or presses that do their own distribution. And every time I see that number, I am both baffled and just so, I feel so much joy to be part of this industry where there are so many opportunities. Now, granted, nobody wants to have to shop their manuscript to 450 different presses, but the opportunities are there. And as you said, Diana, it's just very exciting. It really is. And Abayo, I want to bounce the question back to you. You're both a poet and obviously an editor. How do you deal with failure?
It's been hard. I failed a lot. It's just like the common denominator of my life. It's like 99% of what I do is just touch it and it fails, you know? So it's like I'm just trying to put together the pieces of, you know, a failed life together. And it often baffles me when people read my biography and it sounds like this person who has it all together. I'm just like, I don't know who that person is. But that if I keep trying, maybe I'll get to the place where I can somewhat close the gap. I try, so to answer your question, I'm learning to forgive the person I was. I'm learning through writing, and you will see that as my editor, you can see, you know this.
We've been working together for 12 years.
12 years, I know. And much of it is just trying to learn to accept the broken, wayward person that I was, and I have this ongoing mantra that my commitment is to all people, especially difficult people, and to help them. It's not just so much winning prizes and all these things anymore. I mean, I want to win prizes and have money so I can take my wife out on a date sometimes and all these things because I love my wife so much. But I think that for me, given the person I used to be and where I am now, my commitment is sharing all those failures so that people can have a more straightforward journey and they don't fall into those pitfalls. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. And I hope this doesn't embarrass you too much, but I'm going to do just a little something.
Okay.
And because it's pretty much hot off the presses and show
Oh,
off
no.
Bio's most recent poetry collection with Black Lawrence Press. Isn't it a beautiful cover? Seahorses. It's his latest. Sorry, I had to do it. I had to. So, and again, I'll just chime in a little bit with the, the editorial perspective. And, here at the Press, we publish 24 books a year. And so 24 times a year, I get to participate in the experience of working with somebody who has been shopping, not just the manuscript, but each individual poem, and finally, they get a yes. And it's just so wonderful to make the phone call and to work with somebody to bring their book into the world. And, again, I know there's a lot of rejection in the world, but 24 times a year, we call somebody on the phone and say, we want to publish your book. But I also kind of get the experience on the other side, because all of these books that we publish are pieces of literature that Dawn would, I think, be pleased with me. I have fallen in love with. I've fallen in love with these other people's work. And when we then submit these books that we've worked so hard to, edit and typeset and bring into the world, and we submit them to contests, post-publication contests, and they don't even get on the long list. Sorry about that. I get that. I get that envy of, and I also sort of like, how did you not see how beautiful this piece of artwork is? How did it not even get, move the needle for you? So I kind of see both sides, the sting of rejection and the joy of acceptance. So sorry about that. Any other comments or last minute questions that anybody wants to drop in for our panelists?
We have part 2 on Thursday.
That's true. And I'll go ahead and mention that right now. I'll drop it into the chat box. We have Amy Miller, Darby Price, Marina Blitzstein, and Robbie Gamble, who's here with us tonight. Hi, Robbie. Are going to continue the discussion of the poet's journey. I'm dropping in here right now the Zoom registration link. And of course, we'd love to have you again. And I think we can probably wrap it up there for the evening. Thank you again to JG, Tanis, Christine, Diana, and Aaron, and to all of you who joined us tonight. I'm sorry for the soundtrack in the background. That's probably my cue. So I guess we'll wrap it up a few minutes early tonight. And just sending great appreciation to everybody who's been involved in this project. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.